Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Joining us on the line now is Marilyn S. Greenwald. She's a professor of journalism at Ohio University and a former news reporter. Her book, Jane Fonda, There's a Great Deal to Say, tells the story of Fonda's devotion to movement politics, tracing the evolution of her activism. Since the late 1960s, she's identified as an activist first and an actor second, using her celebrity as a vehicle to convey her views. Welcome to the show, Marilyn.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. So this is really fascinating. What made you want to look into Jane Fonda and her politics particularly?
Well, first of all, I always had an interest in activists, real activists, and how they became, spend 90% of their lives, for a cause. And I like Jane. I never, loved Jane or, I want to do something on Jane. But what happened was an archive that I had worked at before at Smith College in Massachusetts sent a news release that they got the personal archive of Jane Fonda. Now, not the professional, that's at movie archives, but the personal archive. And I thought, well, this would be interesting because she is, an activist. I knew about as much about her as anyone else, kind of what she did. She was an activist. So one thing led to another. This happened during COVID, so the archive was closed. So I really couldn't do much for about 2 years other than study up on Jane. And I read, everything that had been written about her. I read her autobiography. And then I finally got to go to the archive and I saw what was there. And it was really fascinating. And that's when I really knew she's an activist first and an actor second. She's the first to admit that. Now, a lot of people might say that, but she truly, truly is. Yeah. And that's how I got interested in it.
I'm fascinated as to what makes people become activists. So many people sit there watching the news or reading a newspaper and have something to say about it and have a moan at the dinner table. But to actually stand up and do something about it and let everybody know your thoughts and your passions and your worries when you're in the public eye is quite a big deal. A lot of people shy away from that.
You are so right. Or they'll do it for a short time and find it's hard. I don't have the time for this. And she, of course, has been doing it now for, more than 50 years. What she says in her autobiography, she really didn't have much of an interest in current events when she was in her mid-20s. She had moved to France and married a French filmmaker who was much older than she was. And she was pregnant and she had to stay, the first couple months, she had to stay at home. She did, because of her condition. And she started watching American TV and the demonstrations of the Vietnam War. And then she knew people in France who were demonstrating. And she talked to a lot of activists, some of whom were actors in France. And she was an actor, and her husband was a director. And as she sat there, she was pregnant and she heard of the Vietnam War and she didn't understand why America was there. And something in her, I don't want to say it snapped, but, after about 2 or 3 months of this, she said, oh, my God, this is just terrible. People are dying for no reason. I've got to do something. So that, along with her friends who were anti-war activists, who kind of said, yes, we all have to do something. We can't just sit here. One thing led to another. That's how she started. And then I think she was getting some success. She certainly had a platform because even back in her late 20s, people knew who Jane Fonda was. She had done Barbarella and some of those kind of fluffy movies back then. So she had a platform, and so people would listen to her. And I think this kind of, she was enthusiastic about this, that she just wasn't talking and no one was listening. So one thing led to another. But I think that those were the beginnings.
Yeah. And I think it's even harder for people to speak out now, or people speak out a lot less now, I think, because of social media. We see people getting cancelled all the time because they share their views. And if it's not what the mainstream opinion is supposed to be, then people can get cancelled quite easily. But when she was doing it, it was obviously when she started doing it, I suppose, was before, obviously years before social media, but she was getting hate mail. People would write to her letters and be really quite cruel.
Yeah, and this was another reason I was interested in doing the book. I was talking to a friend about her and, the archive, and my friend said, pretty much what you just said. She was the poster child for people taking a person who's a symbol of something and just hating them. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you should hate Jane Fonda, you shouldn't hate Jane Fonda. I mean, whatever your opinion is of anything, you're entitled to that. But for years and years and years, she was a symbol of, something people didn't like, or she was indirectly responsible for people getting killed in the war because she was so vocal in her opposition, So she was one of the first where this endured. And I talk in the book a little bit about, John Kerry running for president of the United States and swift voting. And so this is picked up in the last 10 or 15 years where you take something somebody did, and I'm not talking about a murder or a violent crime or anything like that, and you hanging on to it and passing down the hatred or the dislike of this person. And one thing you ask, well, how are you an activist? How do you stay an activist? Well, one thing you have to do is you can't let it bother you. I mean, Jane had hate mail, threats against her life. I mean, she would have, I think, left long ago, stopped being an activist long ago if she let that bother her. I mean, you have to look and go, I'm so dedicated, I'm not going to let these people, stop me. And she's extremely dedicated. She is strong. I mean, I was, reading her autobiography and even reading her letters, in the archive. She is so physically too, but mentally strong. And you have to be, I think, to be a lifelong activist.
Oh, definitely. It would be very easy to think, whoa, maybe I've said too much, or maybe I need to stop now and focus on my acting, or no one would have blamed her, I don't think, if she did do that. Right.
Well, what's interesting is when she was starting her activism and becoming pretty active she was in her early 30s, she had decided, I don't want to be an actor anymore. I want to devote 100% of my time to this. And she was talking to an activist in Detroit and said, I don't even want to act anymore. I just want to do this. And this seasoned activist looked at her and said, no, you have to be an actor. No one else has the platform that you do. No one else can draw, a couple hundred people with 2 hours notice. And I think it was a eureka moment for her. She said, yeah, she kind of knew it and she didn't know it. And she said, you know what, you're right. And I think that's when she started thinking about using her films, to show, I don't want to say promote her causes because that's too strong, that's too strong of a term, but using her films to demonstrate to people what she thought was wrong with society. And she became a producer and she did end up producing many of her own films.
Yeah, it's really clever how she's done that with her career, how she has picked project or designed projects in a way so she can get some of her messages out there.
Yes, and she's very smart and clever. She knows she has to be subtle. When she was doing Clute, it was the early 70s, and the director, Alan J. Pakula, thought she was a great actor, thought she would do a great job in Clute, but he said, people said to him, I think, are you sure her activism isn't going to get in the way? Or are you sure are you sure people aren't going to say no? People who don't like her aren't going to go to the film. And fortunately, he thought she was such a great actor that he said, no, I want her. But there is that, it has its ups and downs. It's, it cuts both ways. And she was worried about that. So she said, anything she does has to be subtle. It can't be, this is Jane Fonda on a soapbox. This is my movie. I'm on a soapbox. She absolutely knew it had to be subtle. And she said, nobody wants to see that. Nobody, they'll go to a documentary. if they want to see something like that.
Yeah.
You know.
And she is a great actor. There must be people out there who maybe don't believe the same things that she does or don't have the same views, but are quite prepared to put that aside and enjoy watching her in a film. So it's definitely worth that she's carried on both.
Yeah, she has. And, I think directors were aware of what a great actor she is. I think it was the studios, the money people who were always kind of tiptoeing around. For instance, when she did China Syndrome, about, the possible collapse of a nuclear plant, the studio, I believe it was Columbia, the studio in all their publicity material, you never saw the word nuclear. All right. It's kind of laughable now because that's what the movie was about. But the movie was also about the tremendous power of great mega companies, corporations who own everything. And so that's how they were promoting the film as, oh, no, it's not necessarily about nuclear, because they were tiptoeing around that. And interestingly, Jane and Tom Hayden, who was her husband and fellow activist, they had demonstrated against nuclear power. So they weren't hiding the fact that they were against it. They didn't let it wasn't part of the film, and she didn't let her views infiltrate the film. But it was, everybody kind of had to tiptoe around, but it ended up working. These were great films. They were critically acclaimed. They were, box office hits. Mm-hmm. So those films in the 70s, they did work. You'd have to say that.
Yeah. So other than the Vietnam War, what were some of the other things that she's been really passionate about? Well,
interestingly, climate has always been, I think she's known now mostly for that, for her climate activism, but that was not new. She always had an interest in that. And with Tom Hayden, fair housing, Hayden served and a lot of people don't know, he served in the California legislature for a long time. So for a long time, it was kind of those quote unquote everyday things. In fact, she came to the Vietnam War and protesting the war rather late. I think people think, as soon as the war started, she started, heavily protesting it. That's not true. It was on its way out. It was being wound down when she started, and she readily admits it. So in many ways, your question is a good one because most of her activism over the years, has nothing to do with the Vietnam War. It did for a couple years, and then after that, it was over. So it's kind of another misconception, I think, people have of her. She is an anti-war activist. Well, not really. She was, and that's where she concentrated her efforts. She did a lot with Native Americans called Indians back then, and that also got her started in her activism because people like Marlon Brando and other actors were active in that cause, and she became friends with them. And they kind of taught her in many ways how to be an activist. She's the first one to admit that she has evolved as an activist. She's learned from many people, including Hayden. She and Hayden were divorced, and it was kind of a bitter divorce. But then they got together again. They didn't get to, they each married other people, but the bitterness kind of evaporated. But she says in every interview I have ever read, when people ask about her activism, Tom taught me how to be an effective activist. She says that all the time. She readily admits, I was very shrill at the beginning. Sometimes I didn't listen when I should have. And she is a good example of in anything you do, you're not graded at the beginning, and so she was always looking for people she could learn from.
Yeah, I think it's being an activist, particularly in her position as an actor, is something really to be proud of. I'm sure she must be really proud of her activism work, more so than her acting. Nothing against her acting, but because to particularly in this day and age when people in the public eye are so, I was going to say so desperate to be liked, but they kind of need to be liked in order for people to go and watch them in the cinema or to listen to their music or whatever it might be. And as I said at the beginning, people are so nervous about speaking out. So for her to have continuously spoken out throughout her career and for it to have not affected her career really is a massive achievement.
Yeah, another thing that she says consistently in interviews is, well, the influence of Tom Hayden, but also the influence of her father, Henry Fonda, particularly in her First Amendment freedom of speech activism. I think anybody who knows anything about Jane Fonda, particularly when she was an actor, her in the 70s, in the height of her acting, she had an on and off relationship with her father. Her father thought that she kind of went too far in her activism, but people don't understand. Her father was liberal. Her father was always a Democrat. Her father was always a free speech advocate, and she readily admits, my political views were shaped by my father. He, particularly toward free speech. Henry Fonda, he joined the Navy when he was in his late 30s out of patriotism. He certainly wasn't drafted in his late 30s. So there is this devotion to her father. She got what's known as the Steinbeck Award a couple years ago, and I actually listened to the talk live. And she had tears in her eyes, and they were genuine. And she said, "This is for my father." The Grapes of Wrath was a movie that one of her father's most famous movies by Steinbeck, the novel was. And so people, I think, thought, well, Jane and her father never got along. Well, that was up and down. And when she was in middle age, they certainly did get along. She's the one who, wanted to do On Golden Pond, which was about an elderly man and his daughter and middle-aged daughter, and they never got along. And sometimes people ask me, well, just what you learned about her. What do you think her favorite film is? At least, not the last 15 years, but before that. It has to be On Golden Pond. Every interview that I've read about her or seen, and I've seen a bunch of interviews with, she talks about On Golden Pond in a way she doesn't talk about any of her other films. And it's really pretty touching.
Yeah. And a testament to the relationship that she obviously did eventually have with her father, which is nice.
Yeah. And she really became family oriented as she got old. I mean, one thing about activism, it's so consuming that I think a lot of activists later regret that they didn't spend more time with their family. She was like that to some degree. She regrets that she didn't spend more time with her daughter, her daughter who was born in France. But as she got older, she realized the value of family. And one of the reasons, other than acting with her father, she did On Golden Pond, was she said, there's so many middle-aged people that don't get along with their parents. I think there's this image, oh, you're middle-aged and everybody loves their parents and everybody gets along well. And she's realized, that's just not always, sadly, that's just not always the case.
Yeah. And through all the research for this book, were there lots of things that you found out about her that you really didn't know before that really surprised you?
Yes, and there were quite a few. I'll tell you about some of the bigger ones. She wrote the autobiography, and, actors write autobiographies, or they have ghostwriters, or sometimes it'll say, the name of the person and the writer. There was the draft to her autobiography in the archive, and she had editors. We all have editors. But she wrote that. She didn't have a ghostwriter. That's pretty stunning. I mean, I know people who are writers professionally, and it's hard for them to do a book. She wrote, and I could tell in emails she had to certain people, she would say, well, my editor wants, the editor at the publishing company wants me to do this and wants me to do that. She wrote to Tom Hayden once, she wants me to cut the book by, I don't remember, by 25%.
Oh, gosh.
And I had to laugh because I think a lot of famous people would say, I'm not doing that. She said to Tom Hayden, and I'm doing it. And, it's really good because it makes me realize what's really important. I was laughing. I was telling all my writer friends this because everybody I know who's a writer is, I don't want to cut that.
Yeah, exactly.
But she was very good about, I'm cutting it and it makes me, understand what's important. So I was just stunned that she actually wrote the book by herself with the help of editors, but that's completely different than having somebody write the book.
Absolutely.
And she sent people emails about things that happened. She would say, this is how I remember it, 40 years ago. Is this how you remember it? So to check facts like that, I thought was very good. Especially if you're an actor, you pretty much can say anything, and maybe somebody will say, I don't think that's true, but it's okay, But she did. She checked facts and sent people letters and emails. And I was kind of surprised. She had in her archive, I don't know, 50, 60, maybe more letters from Vietnam veterans or people in the armed forces who wrote her over the years, either email toward the end and then letters before there was email. And she answered almost all of them. Because she has copies of the replies. And her answers were long. It wasn't just, hey, thanks for writing. I appreciate it, Jane Fonda. Many of the letters were, I guess some of the letters were negative. Many were not. Many said, I didn't understand what you were doing at the time, but now, 30 years later, I get it. Some were still a little angry. I wouldn't call them vicious, but they were, I don't know why you did that. A couple of them said, it essentially said, I wish you were a little bit softer in your criticism. Maybe more people would have listened to you. That kind of thing. Mm. But she wrote back, and they were personalized responses. And they were long, some of them. And some of them were funny. One person said, I'm a veteran. If you're ever in wherever, Alabama, or whatever city, look me up and let's have coffee. And it was kind of touching, She would do it. I don't think she'd make a special trip, but if she were there, she'd probably do it,
Oh, amazing. What a wonderful and talented and obviously kind woman I think she is.
Yeah, and I got that, and then there's going to be a lot of people who don't agree with that, which is fine, But I did get that. I didn't know what I was going to find in the archive. Who knows? There could have been anything there.
To reply like that, as you say, particularly when she's responding to criticism. So many people really wouldn't do that. They just, they might not read it in the first place, and B, they'd, chuck it aside and not give it the time of day. So that really
especially
says
all
a lot.
of them. Like I said, I didn't count them. There had to be 50, 60 easily.
Wow.
The years.
Amazing. Well, if people want to get a copy of Jane Fonda, there's a great deal to say. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Marilyn Greenwald, who we've been chatting with today. Marilyn, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.